Has President Trump set things up to bring Russia's war in Ukraine to a decent end, or is the peace puzzle falling apart? Closer to home, will President Trump's push to redraw congressional districts in Texas backfire in California? We'll talk about these issues and more on this episode of Independent Outlook. Hi, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from Independent Institute in Oakland, California, where we try and provide an independent take on the issues of the day. So, for today's discussion, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Williamson Evers, Senior Fellow and Director of our Center for Educational Excellence. Welcome, Bill. In addition, we are especially glad to welcome our colleague, Dr. Ivan Eland, who has studied Russian and Ukrainian war strategies more carefully than anyone else I know. Thank you for joining us, Ivan.
Thanks, Graham.
So, Ivan, let's start with you. When Putin joined Trump at that joint base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska, the world was holding its breath. I kind of was. In advance of it, many commentators were criticizing Trump for presuming that he could forge a concrete agreement there with Putin, but without Zelensky. And then after the talks, Trump and Putin failed to announce a concrete agreement, and Trump said he wanted to talk with Zelensky and the Europeans. But then commentators criticized Trump for failing to deliver concrete results from his meeting with Putin. So, Ivan, is Trump at fault for forging ahead without Zelensky, or is Trump at fault for not forging ahead without Zelensky? Which is it? I'm confused.
Well, I think you're quite right. The critics will criticize any president one way, and then they'll criticize him the other way if he does the other thing. So I think in this case, Trump has several contradictions in his policy. The first one is, we were fighting before that. Is we, the U.S., was fighting on, or not fighting, but supporting Ukraine's fight with free military equipment, free economic assistance. Trump, I think, very correctly said, "Well, we want to sort of disengage from that. So we're going to sell the weapons to Europe, and they can give them to Ukraine." In other words, he didn't want the possible of escalation to be there like it was under the Biden administration. I think that was a good thing. But now he was on one side of the war, and now he's trying to mediate between the two sides. It's very difficult to pull that off after you've been on one side. It doesn't matter if it's a new president or not, but it's still a tricky thing to do. And some of his critics are saying he's mediating it toward the opposing side's, Russia, that is, advantage, and his own advantage by getting an agreement to possibly win a Nobel Prize. The second contradiction, I think,
which he's not been shy to talk about that piece.
Right. Well, I mean, that's not necessarily bad if he gets the job done. Then they can see if they want to give him the Nobel Prize or not. So peace, having a incentive for peace, sometimes we don't have that at all. So that's not necessarily a bad thing for him to want that. The problem is the Ukraine thinks he might want that too much and give away their position. The second contradiction, I think, in Trump's Ukraine policy is he correctly wanted to disengage from direct military assistance by selling weapons to the Europeans and then having them give them to the Ukrainians. But now he's pledging to provide security guarantees to Ukraine if it gives up the Donbass to Russia, basically, as Putin wants it to. So no matter if it wasn't in exchange for Donbass, this would deepen future UN involvement way past just giving them the original military aid that Biden was doing. So these are long-term security guarantees. And I think the third contradiction, he seems to want to give a lot for a peace deal, that is U.S. security guarantees, but he's running up against the non-interventionist portion of the MAGA base at home, which would frown on another long-term foreign policy entanglement. And I think, as foreign policy is less important at election time, but I think one of the three pillars that MAGA is based on is, let's stay out of long-term quagmires, right? And this has the potential to be that. So he's also, he's trying to lessen that, which brings us to the third contradiction, and that is he's saying no U.S. ground forces will be used in this thing. But so that entails uh, European ground forces and maybe U.S. air power, intelligence, planning, etc. Or U.S. commander might command the European ground forces, and this would be a non-NATO security guarantee. The problem is if any of the Russians open fire on any one of those European countries that are members of NATO, that triggers Article 5 for NATO. So even if you don't, that's a big problem with all this stuff is that even if you give them, we're going to say, we're going to give you security guarantees, but they're not NATO. But then you're putting in uh, forces from NATO countries, not under the NATO umbrella, but NATO countries nevertheless. If any one of those forces comes under attack, then the NATO alliance is triggered. It doesn't matter uh, whether or not they're on an official NATO mission. Unless you'd have to write that into the agreement that under no circumstances are we going to come to your aid if you get in trouble. But of course, then the Europeans would start squawking because that's what they want and that's what the Ukrainian wants. Everybody wants U.S. involvement, and that's what you get with security guarantees.
So, could you go over the Article 5 thing a little bit? Because some of our listeners might be confused and how it interacts with the constitutional requirement for some kind of sanctioning by Congress of U.S. Military action.
Well, that's a good
Because
question.
I thought, for example,
Oh, go ahead, Grant.
I always thought, for example, that the U.S. can't go to war unless Congress declares war. But it seems like with the NATO agreement, there's been congressional approval in advance to go to war if the president determines. That seems a bit. I must be wrong. I must be wrong.
Well, this was a problem with the League of Nations back when Woodrow Wilson was trying to get it done, that the Congress said, hey, listen, you're committing us to wars through this League of Nations, and we are the war we have the war power. And so that's one of the biggest reasons the League of Nations went down. Now in NATO, they have weasel worded it basically. They say an attack on one is an attack on all, and they say something like national. You have to go through national processes, or I don't remember the exact wording. So
But there
Congress,
is something
and they
like that.
did that
Yeah.
because they knew that this happened to the League of Nations. They didn't want this to happen. But the problem is not with the legalese; it's with the fact that everybody from the 1949 on, when NATO was created, believes that that they had a heavy Soviet tank army sitting right across the border. It was massive in Germany, in East Germany, and everybody believed and everybody had an incentive that if that army came across there, everybody knew that the U.S. was going to be involved. This is a bit different, and all these other countries that we've let into NATO since the early days, they all believed that the U.S. would automatically come to the aid of anybody. And I think if they were a NATO country, then there would be pressure in the Congress to say, hey, listen, we got to approve this because the president wants it, and our credibility as a guarantor of NATO is in question. So I think it's more of an informal thing, sort of like the British getting dragged into World War I with their secret entente with the French. There was
Right.
no
Right.
legal obligation for them to do it. But
But they've
and
done. But they've done the.
NATO's even stronger than that entente. So I think it's more of an informal expectation over a 75, 80-year period that this would happen.
Now, Senator Lindsey Graham wants to formalize this. He wants to say, as part of the military guarantees, what Graham and you have been mentioning, and that is, if there's another Russian attack or Russian fire back and forth, because everybody claims the other side started it, U.S. will be brought in or NATO will be brought in automatically. Lindsey Graham.
So the concern there is that it's the automatic quality of it. Because if it's automatic, there's no space for congressional action really, except maybe after the fact. And if it's automatic, then it really is tantamount to a full NATO guarantee, even if it's not a NATO guarantee. So there seems to be an attempt to give Ukraine a security guarantee that has all the features of a NATO security guarantee, but isn't a NATO security guarantee. It seems like we're trying to square the circle here. Is there any way through this, Ivan?
Exactly. That's exactly your put your finger right on it. And I'm not sure how that would happen. And I'm not sure Putin would ever agree to NATO countries being involved in this because things happen on supposed demilitarized zone. Just go to between North and South Korea to see that. And if some accident happens, Trump, I mean, even if Russia had the purest of intentions, which is very questionable with Putin, I think, but even if they did, they could get into it with NATO just by, having a firing across the border accidentally, or some troops getting too cocky or whatever. And also, there's another problem. What if the Ukrainians did something to provoke the Russians on purpose so that they would be, in a war with NATO behind
Right,
them and Russia?
right.
Because
Because
what you
there are
po-
very militant nationalist Ukrainians out
right,
there
right, and
that
it wouldn't
any
necessarily have to be
territory
the
that was
Ukrainian government even, but the
right.
problem in any of these alliances is your small countries you hear the frontline states, they get cocky and say, okay, now we're in NATO, we can poke the Russian bear, and we're protected. And all of a sudden, NATO's at war with Russia. So that was one of the problems with pushing NATO up into the Baltics, is that this could happen, and Poland as well. And of course, those are very far forward countries, so they're very difficult to defend anyway.
So the New York Times had a article about U.S. air power possibly being involved. Trump has raised the prospect of, even if there weren't troops on the ground, there might be U.S. Air Force, or, you know, the Navy has Air Force. The Marines have Air Force too, in addition to the regular Air Force.
Well,
So, what kind of configuration would that be? Do you just think it would be overflights with taking pictures, or do you think we would have
well, there
pilots based there? Or what are we
Yes, there will
thinking
be
here?
surveillance probably from the aircraft, and also drones. But there would also be probably a demilitarized zone that they would fly up and down to make sure that people weren't, there was no invasion happening
And
surreptitiously or
that certainly
sabotage.
sounds
Yeah. But the
that
problem with
certainly
the air
sounds
power,
dangerous.
you know, you can do that in Libya when Obama did it. He just did air power. But when you're dealing with Russia that has an equal nuclear arsenal compared to the U.S., roughly equal. I mean, if you get into a war and we're bombing, say Russia is, or somebody starts it on the demilitarized zone, NATO gets involved, and then U.S. has aircraft. Well, you can escalate the nuclear war because the U.S. probably won't have
Right
any
there,
incentive
right
to let
there.
Ukraine and the other European countries lose the war. So,
And we have problems near Alaska and Siberia right now, so it's not that there's no, dangers with flights getting near each other also.
So, Ivan, President Trump came into office saying that he could bring peace to this situation, in a snap. I think he said 24 hours. He made some,
Maybe
obviously,
even before he got into before he
maybe. I mean, and I don't mind a bit of exaggeration, but at this point, um, it seemed that hopes were raised by the Alaska summit. Is there really any chance that those hopes could be fulfilled somehow or other? Or is it just back to an intractable opposition that the Ukrainians cannot accept any compromise and the Russians cannot accept any compromise?
well,
Is there a way through this?
I think that's what's going to happen. But yes, well, I think Trump did make an error by rushing the summit, because usually summits have a agreement where the leaders just get together, nibble on some crumpets, and sign the big treaty or whatever, peace agreement or whatever they're doing for the press. This is all staff work that's done staff. Trump likes to wing it like he did with Kim Jong Un in North Korea, but that has a much less of a chance of success because you need staff work, particularly with Trump. You need advanced staff work. And I realize, he's trying to, meet with Putin. He thinks he can, he's a deal maker and he thinks he can talk anybody into it. But Putin's a wily intelligence operative in the past, and I think Putin just has an incentive to string Trump along. He's winning the war. Uh, uh, Not only incrementally, very slowly, but he has in a war of attrition, it's sort of like the North versus the South. The North had so many more resources. They just eventually destroyed the Confederate Army by just attrition. And like if a simple example is if Russia starts with 10 soldiers and Ukraine starts with 4, eventually Ukraine is going to get to 0 before Putin does, like the Confederacy did, and it's going to be over with. And so I think Putin thinks he has this advantage because he has so many more resources and so many more people to throw into the war. And he doesn't really care about casualties because he may have had 1 million casualties from this war. And I think he does have the advantage. So he feels that he's going to keep going. And I think I think what he's doing is he wants to have a better relationship with Trump, but he's trying to get it without solving the problem of the war. So, and as I say, it's more complex. I mean, a lot of the people in eastern Ukraine want to be with Russia.
So also, right after the Anchorage meeting, the Russians had a huge air attack on Ukraine, one of the largest they've ever had. As well, Trump is starting to do these third tertiary type boycotts. So you buy oil from Russia, we impose a big tariff on you. Also, the weapons, the missiles that we're selling to Europe to sell to Ukraine or to give to Ukraine, either one, are now weapons that can be fired deep into Russia. So these are all figuring in how this proceeds.
Ivan, it seems that in eastern Ukraine, where there has long been a lot of Russian or pro-Russian sentiment, if I've got this right, there are basically 4 chunks, counting Crimea. Is there any possibility of those chunks of eastern Ukraine that the Ukrainians might be willing to give up some chunk in order to get peace?
Well, the big region is a place called Donbass, which is Luhansk and Donetsk, and the Russians already have most of Luhansk, but Donetsk is a very valuable area and an industrial area, and the Ukrainians want to keep it, not only because they occupy probably, I don't know what percent, probably maybe, I don't know, 11 to 25% of it. And they want to keep that because it's valuable, but also it's because, they're not going to, Zelensky politically cannot give up any territory that Ukraine now occupies for peace. He just can't do it because the people have sacrificed. A lot of Ukrainians have been killed, wounded, etc., displaced, and their country was attacked, and that's at least that's how the bulk of the Ukrainian population that doesn't live in the East thinks about this. So I just think, there's some things that he just can't do. And he can't do that for the peace. I mean, they would have to the Europeans would have to lean on him too to get him to do that. And some of the Europeans think that would be rewarding Putin for, invading the country. So I just don't see that happening because it's such a political minefield.
It sounds pretty intractable to me. One of the things that is often argued by American observers is that um, Russia's approach to the war has been so viscerally aggressive, and that the question is, what's behind that visceral aggression? Some people say that what lies behind it is simply the desire to recreate the Soviet Union or better, and that therefore if there's any compromise on Ukraine, then the Russians will be emboldened to invade Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, etc. Other people argue that the visceral impulse behind the war on the Russians' part has to do with recovering Russian heartland, which they regard much or most of Ukraine as being Russian heartland. And it is not necessarily an expression of an irrepressible drive to control more and more territory beyond Ukraine. And these interpretations of Russian motives are important because if the former interpretation is true, then there's no compromise because he'll just take more and more and more and more and more. Next thing you know, he'll be in Berlin. But if the latter interpretation is true, then it may not be the case. If what he's craving and if what the Russian people or a certain segment of them are craving is the recovery of Russian heartland, and they recover it, or at least somewhat, then maybe we don't need to worry that it leads to the inexorable drive into other countries. Which interpretation of Russian motives is more accurate?
So this is interesting. Certainly, the Moscow-centered Russia has roots in the Kiev area. So the Rus people, they formed duchies, they formed various princedoms of various sorts. And there was a medieval one centered in Kiev and also is important for the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, over time, Ukraine developed a somewhat different culture from the Moscow centered Russians. It was reconquered by Catherine the Great. So remember the Potemkin village idea? Well, that was going down the Volga River and going into Ukraine and seeing fake false villages. Prince Potemkin was a military commander of Catherine the Great. They call this area New Russia. At various points in Putin's efforts, his propagandists have revived the term New Russia, and it really pertains to where they are occupying right now. No one in the peace talks is really saying, okay, let's turn Kiev over to Moscow. So in terms of that recovery of heartland, so Putin is kind of the kind of politician. He's a dictator, but he also has to have public opinion on his side to a certain extent. So he has kind of different grab bags or pots that he can take messages out of. So he'll, one day he'll be saying, well, the Ukrainians are all Nazis. And there were some collaborators with the German National Socialists in World War II in Ukraine. Yes, a few. And then another time he'll be saying, this is our historic heartland centered on Kievian Rus. Other times he'll be saying, Khrushchev just gave Crimea to Ukraine arbitrarily. He had no right to do this. Another time he'll be saying, look at the Crimea's importance in the Black Sea and where the Russian fleet is installed, and then the surrounding areas also needs to be ours so that the fleet isn't threatened. So it's hard to say what is the internal mental motive. This is mostly him publicly talking about it. I don't think even his closest advisors know what his final goal or his final thing he could live with is. I think we also have to think about, just as when we analyze China, we should be paying more attention to the internal politics and internal needs of the dictator there. In this case, we should be paying more attention to his needs. He's got economic problems, and one of the main ways presidents in democratic countries and dictators in authoritarian countries take the mind of the public off of their economic problems is through nationalism and is through foreign wars. And I think that's a major factor for him here. If he gives up the need to push back the West, the need to prevent NATO from being everywhere on the front door of Russian. What will be the glue that hangs the country together? What will be the emotional, ideological support for him? He doesn't have communism anymore. He doesn't have Bolshevism anymore, as his predecessors have. So he has to have something. And so nationalism is what he's really tried.
And if so, that means that he needs Ukraine for that national satisfaction.
Or he needs something symbolic that's a major piece of it. And the question is, could the Donbass and Crimea and some sort of Finlandization of the Ukraine? The problem is, so Finlandization refers to the fact that in the Cold War period, Finland was a neutral country. It was not hostile toward communist Russia, but on the other hand, it was not hostile toward the West. It was not part of NATO. It had fought 2 wars in the 1940s against Russia and done pretty well for a tiny country. So the question is, what is acceptable Finlandization to the Ukrainian politic, to the Western Europe, and to Russia? And it's very hard, as we have been trying here in this conversation, to kind of spell out what such a thing might be. It's not easy to see because the kind of guarantees that might be politically acceptable to Ukraine and Western Europe are much more than Austria or Yugoslavia or Finland had during the Cold War. They didn't have any kind of NATO trigger troops in there, trigger wire troops. They didn't have any loose connection to NATO. They had nothing. And yet they were in this buffer zone.
I haven't had a comment.
Yeah, I think Bill is right about how dictators, try to manipulate things. The problem that you also have is capabilities. Even if Putin wanted to take over, and reestablish the Soviet Union or reestablish the Eastern European empire that they had during the Cold War, it'd be very difficult to do him. I mean, the Russian military should have won this war easily. He should have been. He thought he was going to go to Kyiv, but the Russian military was so incompetent to start with. Now they're getting better, of course, because as you fight, you see what the enemy's weaknesses are, and then you do that, and then the enemy reacts. And but the beginning, his military, he said he had rebuilt it after the Cold War, but the one problem with authoritarians have, and I think Xi Jinping ought to be very worried about this, is he doesn't know the Chinese haven't fought since a major war since the Chinese Revolution, and they fought Vietnam briefly in 1979, but they have no combat experience. And you can buy all the weapons in the world and train your forces in training, and they'll just collapse because they have no combat experience. And nobody tells the dictator, well, this force is hollow. They're not getting the equipment's not getting the maintenance, the training is all wrong, etc. And so that's what happened with the Russian military. And so and even if his military was in better shape after the Cold War than it was, you still have the problem that he's been exhausted by this one smaller country. And so I'm not sure he's capable. He might raise havoc with the small Baltic states, but he's just incapable. And also, the Europeans are very wealthy, and they really do need, Trump is very correct on this, they do need to spend more resources on defense. The problem that I have with Trump's analysis is if they can do more, then we can do less, or at least less in Europe, and transfer, at the minimum, transfer resources to East Asia to deal with China. But I don't think Russia is as powerful as all these people are saying. Well, if we let them have, a good settlement in Ukraine, that he's going to run all over Europe, because I just don't think he has the capability to do that. And I think Xi Jinping should be very worried. Excuse me. amphibious assaults are very difficult to do, and I don't think the Chinese military can pull it off. So this signaling, like we have to signal Xi that we need business in Ukraine, I think that's probably a little bit shaky as well.
A little overblown, maybe.
Right,
Yep,
Yeah.
signaling and dominoes are overrated.
right, right.
Well, Ivan, what about the Biden model? Joe Biden eliminated the U.S. quagmire involvement in Afghanistan by a very simple expedient. He just packed up and went away. Uh, what if President Trump does something equivalent with Ukraine?
Well, I think he sort of he suspended the aid for a while, and he's not. If he refuses to sell U.S. weapons, I think that will affect the war. But the Europeans aren't going anywhere, and the Europeans should be much more concerned about Russian behavior in Ukraine than the United States should, simply because uh, they're much closer, and they have it's in their. The real question is what they're fighting over is whose sphere of influence is Ukraine going to be in. Ukraine wants to be in the EU, the European uh, sphere of influence, and Russia wants it to be in its influence for cultural reasons, as Bill was saying, for economic reasons, and as you know, one of the invasion routes through Russia. What we haven't really talked about in the long term, NATO has some responsibility for what Putin did. I'm not saying I justify what Putin did in any way in invading, but he does say that he wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO. That's why I don't think he's going to accept the NATO light uh, thing, especially when arrangement, especially when he's slowly winning the war. So they're going to have to give him something. Like if Trump wanted to say, "Well, if you settle this, we're going to take off all the sanctions and we're going to invest in your country." You know, the same things that some of the other countries are doing to pacify Trump on the tariff issue. You know, that might work, but I don't know if Trump could get away with that here in the U.S.
We need to draw this subject to a close shortly here, but I must comment that there's a kind of a deep irony. If it's true that somewhere deep in the Russian soul or in Putin's soul or something like that, there's this craving to recover in the Ukrainian heartland, the Russian invasion and the way Russia has prosecuted the war, the viciousness with which it has been done, the exportation of not only prisoners of war, but children and others out of Ukraine into Russian territory. All of that has generated a much stronger sense of Ukrainian identity against
Mhm.
Russia than
Exactly.
probably otherwise ever would have been the case.
Yes, and he's
And
also
strengthen NATO and
expanded
added NATO
NATO again,
members.
you know, through Finland and Sweden,
Exactly.
and you know, and then if the ultimate thing happens of this, well, the ultimate outcome is that there is some sort of a NATO light security guarantee, which is really a NATO security guarantee, then Putin will have failed utterly in the whole mess. So,
Right, right. So I don't see a clear solution here in our conversation. It's too tangled up. But we can hope and pray for something better to come out of it. In the meanwhile, I would encourage people who'd like to know more. You can find on our website, independent.org, a wonderful set of recommended readings by my colleague here, Bill Evers. It's called Russia and Ukraine: Geopolitics, Liberty, and State Power, an extensive set of readings that gives you a lot of deep background to the conflict. So if you go to independent.org, you can find that. Also, upcoming soon is a new book that we are publishing by our own Ivan Eland here, whose title is Balance of Titans. Oh, I can't remember the subtitle. Do you remember the subtitle of your upcoming book, Ivan, which gives a
peace and liberty
context
in
for all?
a new multipolar world.
There you go. Balance of Titans, Peace and Liberty in a New Multipolar World. Coming out not too long from now by Ivan Eland, which will, I think, give some even bigger context for these issues. Am I right, Ivan?
Yes, nobody, you know, in the foreign policy that we've had discussion that we've had for years and decades, nobody's ever said, what's our grand plan? What are we going to do in the world? What are our interests in the world? Forces do we need to do that militarily? And, you know, strategy and a national plan in place, and it's a more restrained plan than we have. I would like to go back to our interests have expanded dramatically over time from what we used to do. We used to be concerned with the Caribbean and some parts of the Pacific, and of course now it's the whole world. So it just gives a plan how you could shrink that down and save a whole lot of money, and also avoid a lot of these unnecessary wars and quagmires that we've been in the Middle
I,
East and everywhere else.
Ivan, my recollection is that H.R. McMaster, just before he left the administration in the first Trump administration, laid out a grand plan of some sort. Are you in part replying to that?
Well, not so much because it's more of a sort of the status quo. Let's keep doing this
Right.
broad interests. Our interests are everywhere. What wouldn't we get involved in, right? And it's sort of like, I mean, I appreciate somebody trying to put a plan together because there hasn't been one really, but I want to make a more sensible plan. I mean, our national debt is huge, both in absolute sense and then as a percentage of GDP. It's astounding for peacetime. And, we've got a lot of issues that, these resources that we're pumping into, we could spend almost $1 trillion a year on defense. And if you could include all the other stuff like State Department, Homeland Security, the intelligence community, et cetera, it's much more than that. And some of those resources could be turned back to the private sector to, strengthen the economy and that sort of thing.
Let's change the subject to something a little bit less dramatic, which is to say, back here in the US, we have our own little scuffles. I mean, the stakes are lower, but they're still significant. So the question that's looming is who's going to take control of the House of Representatives in the midterm elections next year? And so, in view of that, President Trump has urged Republican controlled states to do some redistricting, redrawing their congressional district maps to give the Republicans a better chance of grabbing a few more extra seats on the margin. And then, in response to that, Governor Newsom of California, he has a plan which I think has been called retaliatory redistricting, whereby he's going to try and persuade Californians in a special election in November to get rid of, at least temporarily, the nonpartisan Citizens Commission that has been drawing congressional district lines so that a new map favoring Democrats can be enacted in California. This seems like quite a tit for tat. A lot does ride on it, though. I mean, President Trump needs his majority in the House, not only for things like Ukraine funding, but also for passing tariff-related things and tax-related things and everything else. Is there going to be any end to this retaliatory redistricting scuffle, do you think? Bill Evers, what do you think about that?
Well, in political science, especially in the social choice, public choice kind of political science, which is sort of applying economics to political science questions, people say that in gerrymandering, which is manipulating the district lines so as to concentrate or dilute your opposition party and to end up with fewer seats for them, they say that gerrymandering is politicians choosing their voters instead of voters choosing the representatives.
That's clever.
But of course it's true, and it has other consequences. If everything is locked in, then voters, if they see they want to change policy or want to throw the rascals out, they find they're stymied. There's no way to do it. And so you need contestable districts. You don't need to have, because of where people live and because of various Supreme Court decisions that favor having a certain amount of majority minority districts. This is one of the reasons, even though in California, maybe there's 35% Republican vote, but we don't have that number of Republican representatives in Congress. So, but even if you try and have contiguous districts so they don't look like weird, strange shapes, and you try and include a city all in one district and all this, you're still going to get some imbalances. There are going to be some heavily populated areas that are going to need several representatives and so forth. So you're going to end up in certain states not exactly matching. And by the way, the Supreme Court may start drifting away from this majority minority district thing, which can, in various states, help either party. In the South, sometimes a Republican legislature will try and put all the blacks in one district. So and this is under the assumption that blacks are all going to keep voting Democratic, which might not always happen. But anyway, they do some of that, and then they think the remaining districts will be Republican. On the other hand, in California, concentrating districts, ethnically, you're going to end up with Latino and black districts that are likely to be Republican, and you're diluting, you're reducing the chances of Republicans having some districts in California. Anyway, they're doing this. You can, if you want to have fun, you can go on Google and go back to 2021 and look at Illinois, where Governor Pritzker, who's now moaning and groaning about Texas, is signing a heavily gerrymandered thing with all kinds of strange shaped districts, despite having promised numerous times that he would never accept this and that he wanted supposedly having independent commissions of the sort we have in California to draw fair districts of some sort. Fair, again, is sort
And
of
then
complicated.
Governor Pritzker
He signed
welcomed
it.
the.
Oh yeah, and then
Well,
now
then he
he's-
welcomed the refugees from
Right.
Texas.
Exactly. So there's a lot of hypocrisy here, and there's also a question of, let's say you like a seemingly fair-minded independent commission drawing the districts. The Democrats think, well, if we don't do something in retaliation for Texas, we're having unilateral disarmament. We're fighting with our hands tied behind our backs. On the other hand, if you favor contestable districts and you keep saying, well, we're going to give them up temporarily, or we're going to give them up for this case or whatever, then over time, you're just going to get more and more and more gerrymandered. I myself think I kind of like contestable districts for reasons that I've indicated. I think the California system, even though it's still strongly disproportionately aids Democrats, it's obviously going to be much worse if there's only 4 Republican districts out of the 50 plus congressmen, members of the House of Representatives from California. And so we should try and keep it, and we should try and get Texas and Illinois and so one of the problems the Democrats have is that some of the states, like New York, that they would like to mine for some more seats, require once every 10 years redistricting. So they'd have to, as in California, they'd have to do a constitutional amendment to get to having a re-gerrymander in New York. And it takes some time in New York and some other states where they'd like to try this. So the overwhelming power that the Democrats have in California is partly what's giving them this sense that there's not going to be any consequences for them. I think that, it's also not the case that no one's going to fight back in California. The League of Women Voters is not happy. The good government types are not happy. Obviously, the Republicans who don't like this are not happy. Charles Munger Jr., who together with Arnold Schwarzenegger led the effort to try to get these fair-minded districts with independent commissions. Schwarzenegger is going to go back on the warpath. Munger is Munger's a very smart guy. He's a physicist. His father is now deceased, was a partner of Warren Buffett. Very brainy family, and Munger is going to fight very hard and cleverly and has money from this Berkshire Hathaway legacy, and he is going to try and tap into the vote. The voters have been polled. They like it's like 2/3 to 1/3. They like now this polling is done before the campaigning that's going to go on, but the residue of sentiment on the part of the voters is they like having contestable districts.
Well, not only that, they like the fact that in California, we actually set a good example in a
Right,
couple of referenda back in 2008 and 2010,
right,
creating this independent citizens
right.
redistricting commission.
And
One
it
of the
was locked
features,
in the Constitution. This is not
yeah,
just a temporary thing.
right. One of the things that's admirable about it is that part of the agreement or the rule created in the Constitution was that a member of that commission, no member of that commission can run for office um,
Right.
under the districts that he creates for 10 years. He has to sit out for 10 years, which really separates the self-interest from the decision-making. That's pretty admirable.
It works reasonably well. The kind of the possible problem with it is that, you have this independent body, but they hire consultants, and the consultants often have a partisan background and often know all about how to gerrymander things. So you have some warring consultants, and you have this problem of the majority-minority districts. So it has its imperfections, but so does all of life. So I think
Well, I think
I haven't had
I
it.
it's
think
pretty good.
California should be commended by that. But the
Yeah,
problem is, um, people think, as Newsom now thinks, that they're disarming when the other side is doing it, and also, as you pointed out, the Democrats do this too, and now both parties
yeah,
do it, and it's very unfair because it's like having a football game and one side or the other hires the referees, right? And
exactly.
but there is a simple way to solve this, but it probably
Right,
will not be adopted. There's a law, they could change one law in 1967. For years, the multi-member districts were permitted in the congressional districts were permitted.
right,
And in 1967, they said, no, you can only have single member districts. Well, if you can reduce gerrymandering or eliminate it by having multi-member districts. And when you get to the five members in a district, it's really gets statistically impossible to gerrymander. Now, yeah, of course, that's a major reform to the Congress. It's easily done, but this is going to and then if you wanted to go even further, you can expand the House so that every state like Wyoming that only has one representative now could do this as well, right? Having one multi-member district in Wyoming, but you'd have to you wouldn't have to do it 5 times, but if you expanded the House somewhat, you could reduce the gerrymandering. So there are ways around it, but it's basically letting the fox guard the chicken coop when you have state legislatures, whether they're Democratic or Republican, making the rules for the election and making these weird shaped districts. But of course, this goes back to the founding. Elbridge Gerry was one of the founders of the
it
country.
actually should, of course, be pronounced Gary,
Gerry,
because
yes,
Eldridge Gerry
right,
was the
right,
Democratic Republican or Jeffersonian Republican governor of Massachusetts.
right.
And he had this in 1812 in the state legislature for Massachusetts. That is the origin of it.
Right. And
Wow.
the problem is it's not going to solve the entire problem because, as you pointed out, the big sort, people are starting to move to where people are like them. And that's politically too. There's other things, religion, culture, et cetera, but there's also politics. So gerrymandering wouldn't solve that problem, but it would make Madison I think Adams also said the legislature should reflect the people. And it really doesn't, both
So
in Democratic and
another thing,
Republican states.
that could be done, and this actually runs counter to representing the people proportionally, would be to say only one redistricting per 10-year period. So Kevin Kiley, who's a congressman about to be gerrymandered out by the Newsom plan, has proposed that Congress say only one per 10-year period.
That
That would
sounded
solve a
attractive.
certain amount of this. But of course, as the demography changes, more people being born, migrants getting nationalized, people moving from one state to another, that can change over the course of a 10-year period quite a bit. So it might not be that crazy to have mid 10, every 5 years or something like that in some states. The Wall Street Journal had several pieces saying, look, surprise, surprise, with the next census, California is going to lose more people, and the Republican-leaning states are going to gain more people. So even if they do something like this, this is more behavior that drives people out of their own state. Wall Street Journal also had an editorial where they said there's algorithms that you could use to prevent certain kinds of gerrymandering. It's too complex and in the weeds to get into in this
Well, that's
discussion.
always
But
been a big counter to the people who say, well, we don't want gerrymandering. And then they said, for a long time, people said, well, but what's a fair district?
right,
What's a fair district? But now they do have these algorithms
they
where
have
you can,
algorithms.
they measure wasted votes, what they call wasted votes and stuff. So,
Right.
so the technology is getting better. And also I think, everybody thinks it's a competitive system with two parties. But it's roughly evenly matched at the national level, how many representatives are elected Democrat and Republican in the House. But locally, there's very little competition. There's very few competitive congressional districts anymore.
Right. I'd like to keep more of them.
Yeah, I
I
would
think
too.
it's
I think you got to have
healthier.
competition in the political system.
Otherwise, it's not. It's a democracy in name only if it doesn't have some competitive races. So
I predict, as a Californian myself, I predict that the citizens of California are not going to be persuaded by Governor Newsom to engage in retaliatory redistricting. I think his proposal is going to go down, and that's going to be embarrassing. But we shall see.
we shall see. You said, "Oh, this is much more low key than Ukraine and Russia."
Well,
Actually, to listen to the rhetoric of the
right.
people, particularly on the ones that want to do the retaliatory redistricting, they are very hopped up. They are
Oh, I know.
very, very, this is how do we prevent Hitler or
They're
whatever it
getting a
is
lot of
they're
psychic
talking about.
gratification out of their emotions,
Right.
I
So
think.
one of the big problems for the Democrats is they haven't really found very good grounds on which to try to fight Trump. Trump is
Right.
doing a lot of things that
He's doing everything everywhere. It's hard to fight.
he's doing a lot of things, and a lot of them are 70-30, 80-20 type of things where the Democrats are on the less popular side.
Mhm.
And so they're feeling very frustrated, and they, if they had wanted to fight on tariffs, maybe they would have had some popular support, but they don't want to fight on that.
No,
So
they don't, right?
it's
They've been pro-tariff in
so
the
this is
past.
something where they're vitally engaged because they view their potential power at stake. And I don't know, I think as Graham was saying, the public may have a more jaundiced view of this than the Democratic politicians
Okay,
hope the public will.
another topic or two briefly. Okay, so you're the U.S. president, and you really, really want the Federal Reserve to drop the interest rates. And then, the Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out with an unemployment report, which is unfavorable, which would be to your advantage because that might persuade the Fed to lower interest rates. But then you're the president who doesn't like bad news, and so you fire the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who came out with the negative unemployment result, unemployment figures. Does this mean that we can really no longer trust official numbers about employment, unemployment, et cetera, upon which many judgments rest? What's going on here?
I think, I think you've summarized the situation pretty well. I think the Bureau commissioner doesn't really have much power over the statistics. They're gathered by underlings. It has a whole bureaucratic automaticity to it. There are some problems with gathering the data the way they do now. It might be done better, more efficiently in some other manner, but that's not what the fight is over. The fight is
Right.
over the fact that there were these large monthly adjustments that took place that showed that there was more unemployment than had been earlier thought. I think, I think they're correct. There are also private people that gather some of these same statistics, and the adjusted statistics match what these private gatherers, collectors have. The person that is put in as a replacement, I believe he has to be confirmed by Congress. I don't believe he has been yet. He is generally, so let's say he was, so the woman he worked at Heritage, the woman who preceded him at Heritage and who is now at the Manhattan Institute said he's a bad economist. The main economist in this field at American Enterprise Institute said he's a bad economist. The main Cato Institute person who's in this field said he's a bad economist. So I think he certainly has to prove himself. Anyway. So I also think it's possible that either, government uses this stuff, these statistics all the time for decision-making of various
Right.
sorts. It's not obvious that private entrepreneurs use these statistics that much. Mostly they have a knowledge of their own field of economic endeavor. They can see the prices that their competitors are charging. They can look at who, their staff, their employees, who they're losing to other competitors or who they're needing to pay how much. They don't really need U.S. Labor statistics data to do this. Now, private enterprise also doubles or duplicates a lot of this material right now. There's a Yale Institute that does it. There's various people. And, those people are not going to do it for free. If the Bureau is unreliable in the future and people need this data, they're probably going to have to pay somebody to give it to them. But from a classical liberal standpoint, good. They should have to pay for it. There's no reason the public should necessarily be subsidizing business by providing them this data. And, we might end up in a position where, like China, the data is worthless pretty much. And, so then the data
That's
is
a shame.
worthless.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
it's a shame, but it might be a good opportunity for private entrepreneurs in the statistics
right. It
gathering
might well
Well,
business.
it'd be
Now,
one thing if it would just go away, which is what you're saying, it would probably be a good thing. It's another thing if somebody grabs it and starts manipulating the
It's
data for political reasons. Then it gets
right.
thrown into the political arena, which
That's right.
you don't really want to have happen. You'd rather just have it go away and let the
You
private
would.
sector,
The other thing that's true now is that some of these statistics gatherings, by the way, this applies in education, my own field. The Trump people drastically cut the staff of the statistics gathering people in the Department of Education. So we don't know whether that data is going to be any good. They're supposedly transferring this to the Census Bureau. However, I haven't seen that operationalized yet. But anyway, that's a digression. The one thing that there's a common good aspect, there's public good aspects to this data, putting it out, but also in gathering it. So let's say you're the Bureau of Labor Statistics and statute says that if you make an inquiry to a company about their employment records or something, they have to supply it to you, okay, as a matter of law. Now, a private entrepreneur who's trying to get the same data, they're going to probably have to pay the company to do something that's onerous and burdensome to that company to gather this data. So it's going to be more difficult if private enterprise has to do it. On the other hand, if there's a demand for it, people will figure out how to do it. And we live in a much more electronic society, so it should be easier than it was in the 19th century or in
Well,
1920 or whatever.
I just think that if I had been President Trump and this bad unemployment number came out, instead of firing the person in charge of it, I would have called up Jerome Powell and say, "Hey, look, bad unemployment. You've got to reduce interest rates." And then he would have gotten what he wanted out of the Federal Reserve. But instead,
The,
he fired the head of the statistics department.
the wonderful thing about the gold standard is there's no president calling up or
Exactly.
pressuring the head of the Federal Reserve because it's automatically
Mhm.
adjusting to supply and
Exactly.
demand for gold. So
Yes, and so I recommend that our viewers who are interested in that subject go to our website and look up a recently published book by our senior fellow Judy Shelton called "Good as Gold: Unleashing the Power of Sound Money," taking up that
and
topic.
she has often been mentioned. She was during Trump's first term. He put her forward as a nominee for the Federal Reserve because it was towards the end of his administration. It got kind of fell between stools. She has been mentioned again, not nearly as prominently as during his first term, but it's conceivable she may get on the Federal Reserve Board in the
She would
future.
be a good influence. Okay, one last little parting shot. I'm looking at America's greatest city, uh, which is going to elect a new mayor, and apparently the leading candidate is the candidate of the Democratic Socialists of America, Zoran Mamdani, and he is going to solve a lot of problems in New York. For example, there are these areas of New York City where there are no good grocery stores. And so obviously the solution to that is for the city government to stand up and run grocery stores. What could go wrong with that?
Well, I mean, I tried this in Kansas City, Missouri. It was a disaster.
I didn't know that, Bill.
It just closed down like in the last week or so. But they've had this for some years, and shelves are bare. There's crime all around it. There's theft, stealing by the staff, just every nightmare you could have. And there's no incentive to run an effective grocery store there. So it might as well not be there, except that it's
Hmm.
draining, providing some salaries for some people and draining the taxpayer's coffin. I don't see any different result in New York City. I would add he has other horrible views. They have a thing in New York called rent stabilization, which is another term for rent control. And he, of course, has been living. He has a very high salary, and he comes from a rich family. Not that we're against that, but he's being supplied with he has a rent controlled apartment, and so it's for New York City. It's pretty inexpensive. There's plenty of towns where it would be viewed as expensive, but for New York City, it's viewed as very cheap. And so it's sort of unusual. It's not ruled out by the law that a rich person can't be in a rent stabilized apartment in New York City, but the rhetoric around rent control is this is supposed to help poor people. And so he's not poor and he's living in such a thing. And he wants to freeze rents and he wants to extend the power of rent stabilization. This will, of course, diminish the housing stock. There will be fewer rental properties. People won't invest in this. The landlords will not maintain the units. I could go on. Rent control has been said to be very similar to bombing of cities in terms of what it
Right.
does to the housing stock. So,
Yeah, it's a recipe for housing crisis. There won't be enough housing. Bad
absolutely.
enough now, it'll be 10 times worse.
And in my own field of education, he is horrible. He opposed he. So think about New York City and what's happened in recent
It's
years.
kind of the
Well, we had
Venezuelanization of New York City.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a good statement. Cubanization, whatever. In education, they had bad lockdowns. They have a very powerful labor union that was, completely against going back to school. Mandami went along with that, praised it, endorsed it. He is supported by the teachers union. He's against charter schools. Charter schools in New York City have done better. So the blacks and the Latinos in charter schools are doing better than the kids in regular charter school, in regular school, public schools. So they've closed the achievement gap, which is an amazing thing. And in the country, whites are here and blacks are here for 30% gap. And this has gone on as long as we have testing. In New York City, the blacks are above the regular public. If they're in charter schools, they're above. So what is the progressives' view? The progressives' view is, well, crush charter schools. What idiots. That means that they're
Yeah.
really aligned with the teachers' unions and not with the pupils. So
Yeah.
he has that. It's hard to see. Oh, and the person he wants to make the chancellor of the charter schools is a left-wing former congressman who was in the squad, so-called, and is the one that set off the fire alarm when they were supposed to be having a vote in Congress. So he's a real catch for the children of New York.
And Mamdani has also announced that he wants to increase taxes on areas where white residents are predominant. It is a kind of
And of
racial
course-
taxation.
And of course, there's a large Jewish population in New York City, and he has a history of mouthing off about Jews and about Israel and so forth in a way that's, everybody can have criticisms of Israel. It's not a perfect country, but to single it out in a truly just unfair way, in a way where, Egypt or Lebanon or Jordan or something has the same problem, but you only criticize Israel. It's a little peculiar to do that persistently over the years. And I don't want to turn into a big defense of Israel here, but the guy seems to be motivated by anti-Jewish sentiment.
He does have, I would say, a certain charm to him that other
yeah.
candidates
He's good
obviously
looking.
lack.
He's good looking.
He's a good talker.
He's a great talker.
He's a snappy dresser.
He's a snappy dresser.
He
comes from a high. So one parent is a movie maker and the other parent is a professor. I mean, he comes from the elite new class of American society.
I was surprised that they were counting on Cuomo to beat him. They should have had a better candidate.
What a strange idea.
Well, and also New York Magazine has an article, very current, saying why the opposition to Mamdani is falling apart. Well, the problem is you have these several candidates. So you have Cuomo. So Mamdani already beat Cuomo. Plus, Cuomo had this terrible lockdown policy where he was putting people still live and contagious with COVID-19 into rest homes. So killing off the people in the rest homes. And then he hid all the data on that in a very, very evil way. He also went along with the closing down of schools in New York City. And then he had this problem with women where he was cavorting with them where they weren't too happy with it.
He was abusive.
Yeah. And so then you have Adams, and Adams is the current mayor. And so all these are Democrats, Mamdani, Cuomo, and Adams. Adams is a former policeman. He's been okay as a mayor. I mean, he's not that effective, but he's tried to improve law and order some. He's not attacking charter schools. He's even been certainly more friendly than Bill de Blasio was, and more friendly than Mamdani would be. He has this corruption problem where he was maybe giving away stuff to Turkish people, Turkish businessmen, whatever. That's kind of gone away, possibly because of the Trump people being happy with Adams because he was cracking down on immigrants. And then you have Silva, who is a former street vigilante guy. He's a pretty good candidate. He's a Republican, though, so he doesn't really stand a chance of getting elected. So the only way somebody can really beat Mamdani is if the two other opposition candidates drop out effectively somehow. But their egos are all too big, and they think, Adams says, well, I'm the incumbent. I should be in there. Cuomo, I'm former governor. I should be in there. Silva, I have the Republican line. Nobody,
So it seems highly likely that Zoran Mamdani
Yeah.
of the Democratic Socialists of America will be the next
Right.
mayor of New York City. But you never know, though, how things work out. I mean, he's a pretty smart guy, and it's possible that he may not govern in a way that's as mistakenly radical as he seems to advocate or has seemed to advocate.
Well-
Maybe he'll read materials from the Independent Institute
Oh.
and rethink
I
some
don't.
things.
I'm not thinking that's going to happen. But I will say that the
I'll send him some books.
Or you'll have a massive failure in America where all the national media is, and there'll be a backlash, and maybe then the people will turn to the
I know, the
Independent
worst- the wor-
Institute for the
as they
solutions,
had
right?
the German communists had that theory. They called it "Knock Hitler uns." First we'll
Yeah.
have Hitler, and then everyone will turn to being a communist. So this would be kind of some other strange version of that. I want to mention something about the Democratic Socialists in America, because at their last national convention, they had a whole panel on the family, and they want to abolish the family, and they want to abolish. They want to have communal child rearing, and I mean it's kind of early Soviet Union utopianism of some sort in terms of the family leads to capitalism and leads to imperialism and leads to racism and on and on and on.
And there's no
I'm not
difference if
sure
you-
the voters of New York City are really that hot on abolishing the family.
But you know what's interesting is that both Mamdani himself and his parents live in very stable, conventional,
Right.
bourgeois,
Right.
marital family relationships,
Exactly.
condemned by the Democratic Socialists of America. So
certainly do.
maybe there's hope. Maybe there's hope. We have to stop because we've been going on a long time. But I'm grateful to both of you for your insight, especially grateful for Ivan, all the thinking you've done and study on the quagmire in Ukraine. You didn't solve it for us, but you made it a little bit less murky. Thank you so much for that, Ivan.
Thank you.
And Bill, thank you for your polymathy, shedding light on every subject we touched. And let me just tell our friends, thank you for joining us on Independent Outlook. And of course, I invite you to head to our website, independent.org, for a bunch of useful resources on these and other topics. You can look up things by these two gentlemen who we've been speaking to today on our website and find their latest writings and publications.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Bill.
You're most welcome, and we'll see you next time on Independent Outlook. Take care.